and welcome back to Scottish Independence Podcasts. This week's episode was recorded on location at the Scottish Currency Group Conference in Dunfermline and includes some of our highlights and also some behind-the-scenes conversations. If you'd like to watch all the speeches from the conference, the link is in the notes.
Here we are, we're in Dunfermline, we're in Fife College in Dunfermline.
Brand new Fife College as well,
College.
Carnegie Centre.
Really nice venue, nice building, and we're here for the Scottish Currency Group Conference. This is a tea break. There's an awful lot of information to take in, and it's good stuff. I mean, some of it we've done podcasts on before. We might tell you a bit about that in a minute. But yeah, good day and decent turnout from people here.
Yeah, it is good day. It's slightly different from last year. That was very much about the nuts and bolts. Yeah. And this is more, I think they're trying to do more visionary kind of stuff. Is that working for you?
Well, it's definitely working for me because, I mean, obviously, you're setting up a new independent country with its own currency. You need to know what the nuts and bolts is going to be. So obviously, but yeah, that was a bit more of what they did last year. Whereas, I think it's more about ideas. And actually, I think Ian and Tim, when we talked to them a couple of weeks back, did use that. Sort of said it's more about ideas.
Ian Stewart explained a bit more in his introduction.
For those of you who were here last year, you'll know that my background is in banking, 40 years career banker. Specialism in the latter part of my career was in payments. I was director of switch card services. I was also the UK's sole director on MasterCard's Global Advisory Board for all things debit cards. So it's with that background that I was invited to join the Scottish Currency Group because payments are a critical factor in their move to independence. So that's my background. The one thing I would say is I hope you've all enjoyed the conference to date. Last year we did the how of setting up a Scottish currency. It's not that difficult. This year the focus has been on the why. And I think you'll agree with me that we've had some fantastic ideas. In fact, we could have called the Conference of Ideas, because that's really what we're interested in doing. We're not interested in issuing a currency just for the sake of it. We're interested in creating a currency to benefit the people of Scotland as we move forward. The actual developing a currency plan for Scotland, in the more mundane sense, we meet every fortnight. The small group of people, dedicated volunteers, none of us are paid for the work we do. And my own involvement has been over the last 4 years. And the work plan we've had since I last addressed you last year, we've been, and I must mention this, we've just launched a new website, which I'd encourage you all to look at. Website that we're very, very happy with, the new website. It's interactive. And thanks to all the team on the currency group, excluding myself, because as you can see, I still work from paper. But thankfully, there are many more people, much more capable than I am, in new technology. So the website has been one of our key deliverables over the last 12 months. The other one, of course, is planning for conference. Tim has done a great deal of work in that and pulled together a fantastic number of people to present here. And of course, the big event for us all in the Currency Group has been commissioning Professor Lauren Joy to do this research into what would be the most beneficial currency proposition for an independent Scotland. The other things that we've been doing over the last years are influencing the movement. Tim mentioned our Facebook page, and we actually talk to branches, and we're quite happy to talk to anybody who's interested, preferably by Zoom, because like myself, I live in the Isle of Skye, so even to get the Central Belt takes me 6 hours, so I could actually fly to Lanzarote quicker than I could actually come to any meeting. We're happy to do it by Zoom, and so that's the sort of thing we've been doing. It's fair to say that our collective thinking on a Scottish currency isn't to create a mini version of the United Kingdom. So it's also fair to say that the bond markets might be significantly frightened by some of the suggestions and some of the ideas that we have for an independent Scotland. Anybody that wants an insight into what is of interest to the general public should always ask their taxi driver. I don't know if it's actually true, but I believe it or not, I still have unionist friends, ex-bankers, and that's not easy. But one of them actually worked for Better Together, and he claims that Alistair Darling came up with the idea to say to Alex Salmond, no, you can't share the pound, after talking to his taxi driver on the way to that meeting. It may be true, it may be not, but that's what he said. Anyway, it was my wife Irene, when she's coming to the conference this morning, the taxi driver asked her what's going on in the conference centre. And Irene explained what it was. The taxi driver volunteered. Independence. Oh no. I've heard my parents talk about this. Oh no, they're too feared. They're feared. They're wondering about what's going to happen to their pension and what's going to happen to ASDA. So, let's put things in perspective. We can have all the very intellectual discussions we want and all the rest of it, but if we really want to convince the ordinary person who need to vote for us, we have to bring it down to a situation that they can see that they will get a benefit. No, ASDA will stay in Scotland. It could be a separate company. And by the way, we're going to increase your pension. That's the answer. And that's the sort of thing we need to actually have. And that's what we work on in the Scottish Currency Group. Another interesting topic we've discussed in the Currency Group is mortgages. I've got 2 daughters. Their biggest concern, as being young people, is the cost of their mortgage and interest rate. Well, why don't we actually offer from the Central Bank of Scotland a fixed rate interest mortgage for 30 years? We could do that. People will say, oh no, we can't do that. Yes, we can. With our own currency, we could do that. And it's not something new, because my long-departed father-in-law, he actually had a 2.5% mortgage from Annan District Council on his former council house. So district councils in Scotland used to offer this in the pre-Thatcher era. So this is not something new. This is something that we could do. It's something we could go into a campaign and say, right, young people, vote for us. This is what we can do. In terms of industry, public ownership, Robin, McAlpine, William, everybody agrees we need to bring the actual manufacturing jobs back to Scotland, using the assets of Scotland, and that means taking public ownership. So these are sort of things we discuss. And by the way, I think now somebody mentioned central bank. The first thing we should put in terms of the perspective for the Scottish Central Bank is an obligation to create full employment. Central banks sometimes have that, and for us to rebuild Scotland, we can make a commitment to full employment, because we're going to have to invest hugely in infrastructure. We're going to have to go into a deficit to do that, but we're going to fund that deficit from our own currency. And finally, my last own point is, we talked about the location of the central bank and the civil service departments. Well, my suggestion is the central bank will be based in Glasgow. The civil service departments will be in Dundee. The last place they're going is Edinburgh. Let's put them into the yes cities, the cities that backed independence, Glasgow and Dundee.
We've just talked to Craig Dale, because he gave a talk here, but we had a little chat with him afterwards, and he just brought up this really useful image, didn't he?
Yes.
It's a different pin in that map that connects everything, isn't it? Yeah. You've got your house pin there, you've got your currency pin there, and all the threads all crossing past each other. What is currency for? To flip my own question in a different direction. Is it a hoard of wealth, or is it the lubricant that makes everything else happen? If we start using currency like that, if we start using it as not something to be hoarded, we're not dragons looking for our pile of gold coins, but starting to say, right, well, this is just an accounting thing that we're flowing between an idea and a reality. I mentioned that thing about pensioners, get a substantial portion of their retirement income from their capital asset, their house. It's not always easy to extract that asset, because on paper you can be quite wealthy, but downsizing from a 3-bedroom house that you bought for £100,000 and selling for £300,000 to buy a 1-bedroom that is now £200,000, you don't get as much as you thought you might.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And I think that image, like this currency is a pin, and then there's another pin that's housing, and then there's lots of other pins. But how they're all interconnected That's just a brilliant way to think
That's it. It's a great image. But actually, Commonweal's next book, of all the different books and how they go together.
I love working for Commonweal because we're not a normal think tank that just says, right, we are the housing think tank or we're the economic inequality think tank. We do everything. So my job is to look at all these things and exist in that web of red string between them all. It boggles even my mind thinking about it, but I love moving through that forest of thread to find the interesting things.
Yeah. Thank goodness you do. Thank goodness you do. Yeah, thanks. When he was talking to us about housing, and he just covered loads about the intricacies and the possibilities that there are for good quality social housing, but also how that kind of ripples out to the rest of, to me. I didn't even think, I didn't even know there was a housing crisis in Scotland because there isn't one for me.
You go almost anywhere in the housing landscape in Scotland, and wherever someone is in it, unless they are like at the top, they know the problems that are facing them. They don't necessarily understand the problems that are facing others. Right? If you're a house owner and you've always been a house owner, and you bought your house, maybe you did buy your house from the right to buy boom in the 1980s, and you've seen it speculate up, but you've never moved. The value of your house is meaningless to you because it's a roof over your head. Yeah. Right? You don't necessarily understand why your kids are complaining that they can't buy a house. And you bought a house in your mid-20s, you could afford it. Their wages are lower and the houses are more expensive. You don't necessarily see that. Or if you don't necessarily see if someone is renting, well, why can't you just redecorate your kitchen? Yeah. I do know folk who have had trouble understanding it. I'm not allowed to. But if you're in that situation, you know the problems that you get with not being able to repair things because your landlord is absent. You might not even know who they are, or the factor doesn't respond. So wherever you are there, you can see the problems where you are. As I say, it's about getting the landscape of the problems out there and then bringing everyone together into the solutions for it. Why would it be better if we did this? A lot of it is bound up in legislation. A really good example is this year with the housing bill. I was being a little bit flippant during that talk, saying that it's only this year that tenants have the right to repaint their kitchen, and that's something that tenants in Germany have done for decades. But it does show how far behind Scotland is. On the other hand, it's still progress. The stuff that we've been talking recently about rent caps, the rent cap that was passed this year is actually more or less the same as the rent cap bill that was timed out because of the 2021 parliamentary election. There was a legislation in the Parliament that would have got that rent cap 5 years ago, but Parliament ended up closing and we didn't get it then. On the other hand, that rent cap, all that does is allow landlords to raise rents by only a little bit above inflation. It's still an above inflation rise. It's still, as you say, increasing that wealth gap. And in places where rent is right now too high, saying, well, you'll only get a 6% rise next year, it's not really much comfort. Mentioned during the talk, I do have issue with still that bent towards foreign direct investment and mid-market private rents and affordable houses, which are still just expensive houses. Keir Starmer down in London, the Labour government, they want to reduce the amount of affordable housing that developers have to put in their development. So if they build 100 houses right now, 35 of them need to be affordable. He wants to reduce it to 20%, right? Which would reduce developer profits, which might mean more public subsidies or might mean less public subsidies. Might mean if those affordable houses are social rent, which often they are, they're not always, but often are, that reduces council budgets. All of these things have complex implications for things like the Barnett formula. So I see Mary has asked the UK government, if that goes through, will that reduce Scottish budget and reduce Scotland's ability to supply affordable housing? It's a very, very good question with not a completely clear answer at the moment. On the other hand, maybe we should stop talking about affordable housing and start talking about social rented housing again. Yeah. There are housing developments all over the UK that are sold with conditions like you must live here and you must live here for X number of years, or you have to pay back the money or pay a penalty. So they absolutely could do that. You see sometimes estates, sort of fairly run-down estates, where they sell the house for £1 on the basis that the resident lives in it, does it up and lives there. So you can put these conditions on. You can also just say, no, it's not an affordable rent quota, it's a social rent quota. The council gets to own these houses, so stop the flipping. But yeah, that brings us into the basically the stranglehold that these developers have over policy. Because if we did say, right, we're upping your affordable house quota to 50% and they're all going to be council houses, right, and the developer just says, well, we won't build them. Right? That's the threat they use. And Scotland doesn't really have the alternative. We don't have the policy there of being able to say, okay, well, you don't want it, we're going to expropriate your land at existing use value because it's a brownfield site and doesn't have planning permission anymore. And we're going to bring in just any developers, any collection of developers who want a plot or two, and we're going to work with the Scottish National Infrastructure and Scottish National Housing Company to build the rest. We just don't need the Persimmon anymore. Or whatever other developer we just don't need anymore. You take that lobbying power from the developers out, and then you can see how the legislation starts to flip in a different direction as well. This is why housing is so complex. This is when Nye Bevan was right. First, if you want to build a house, you have to fix everything else. But also, if you're building a house, it's a sign that you've fixed everything else. It's that attitude of, right, okay, we need to fix everything else, but we now have the opportunity to fix everything.
We thought, well, that's a really easily imagined image, isn't it? So over here you might have housing, and over here you might have foreign direct investment. How are those two things connected? Well, it turns out they are very closely connected, and one has implications for the other.
Here, so I thought that was brilliant because, you could have currency is almost in this, from the centre, at least from this conference, it's maybe in the centre. And then these other things, housing, they're all interlinked. And I just thought that was a really good way of talking to people about it because in the end, that's what about it, isn't it? It's how do you actually help people get the hang of what's wrong with the current setup and how that could be better.
This next clip comes from William Thompson from Scotonomics. In his presentation to the conference, he homed in on a very specific part of Scottish Government's proposals that he disagrees with, and he explains why. Here he is.
But I'm going to concentrate on this one idea that's been re-emphasised in their Fresh Start paper, which was out just 2 weeks ago, that says that Scotland will align with the European Union's Stability and Growth Pact. So basically, this says that every year the government is not able to borrow more than 3% of GDP. Okay, so the difference between what it spends and what it taxes can't be more than 3% of GDP. And there's another bit which is 60% debt to GDP. But as an independent nation, this won't apply to Scotland because we don't know what its starting debt level will be. So we only concentrated on this idea that the government can only have 3% of GDP difference between what it taxes and what it spends. Now, this is similar to what the UK government has at the moment. And what we're going to use to explain the impact of that decision is something called sectorial balances. So sectorial balances are a macroeconomic framework because it's based on accountancy. Okay? It measures all the financial transactions in an economy. And when you look at financial transactions, as everyone knows, for every debit, there's a credit. For every asset, there's a liability. So someone's deficit is someone's surplus. And when you look at the economy, you can split it into three different sectors. Public sector, the private sector, which is all of us, and the foreign sector. So if there's a surplus in the foreign sector and a surplus in the private sector, there must be a deficit where? Public sector. So it's very simple, and you'll hear a lot of economists who come up and say, this is a law or this is fact. And in economics, there's no such thing. But when you use accounting identities, you're able to say, this is true, and no economist can argue against it. If there's a deficit in one sector, it must be matched by a surplus in one or the other sector. So it's a really good place to start from analysing the impact of decisions which affect your economy. I'm hopefully close to encouraging the Scottish Government to release the sectorial balances. I had a conversation with the Chief Economist on Tuesday for an hour, and he said they'll look into doing this, which would be a really good thing for us as a clear understanding on what impact government deficits have. Okay, so we wanted to look at Scotland's sectorial balances, but we had a problem. There aren't any. So we had to start them, we had to create them. Now, this is roughly what the Scottish sectorial balances said for last year. So the foreign sector balance has an 8% surplus. So all that foreign direct investment that we love, the Scottish Government love, it comes in, but 8% of it goes out every year. it goes to the foreign sector. So foreign direct investment is a huge issue. And I'd like to address that question you asked about attracting investment and needing people to invest, because we don't as an independent nation. We do not need any foreign income coming in, because we'll have a government which can create its own currency. And this is the huge problem that we've got. And no one in the Scottish Government has identified this or come up with a plan to approach it. Now, we have a private sector surplus of 2% of GDP, okay? So 8 and 2 equals 10. Where does that come from? Public sector. So this deficit is Scotland's public deficit. So this is all forms of government, principally Westminster. So the reason that we have a plus 2% GDP surplus in Scotland is because we have a public sector deficit. And we need that deficit because so much money leaks out of the country. So no one had ever really looked at this before. And this is the starting position where we're likely, if we're independent in the next few years, approximately, roughly where we would be. Now, here are Scotland's sectorial balances. Because everything balances, there's a zero line along the bottom. If a sector's in surplus, it's above. If it's below, it's in deficit. So fairly simple, but you can see how rarely the Scottish private sector net saves. And net saves is just a simple term that means that we spend less than we earn. Okay, so it's not savings, it's saving. We spend less. Look how often we're in a position as a private sector, everyone in this room, households, businesses, financial services sector, normally we don't save. Now, this is a huge issue for Scotland going forward. Now, we are only able to save. Anyone remember what happened in 2019? So huge influx of government money allowed us to save. So it's a huge issue. We've got so much money leaving the country. The pound never leaves the country, but the ownership of the pounds leaves the country. So huge issue. But this proves why you need a public sector deficit. You need this because that money effectively has to come from somewhere. And the public sector deficit, and we say in the paper, it is what it is. If you have 8% of GDP leaving, and if you want your private sector to save 2%, then the deficit, the public deficit, has to be 10%. It's impossible. There's an accounting identity. It can't come from anywhere. So we're sitting at 10 at the moment. Who remembers the figure of the Stability and Growth Pact? 3. So where does that 7% come from? And that's what we addressed in the paper. So there's a desire to have this 3%, but how do we actually get there? And when we looked at all of the economic papers, we found that there's too little investigation into this transition period. How do we get from where we are now to where we want to be? And we can use GERS as a reasonable place to start. And in the latest paper, there's been a big political fudge. And they've said, actually, GERS is no use. So we're now going to say we've got no idea where Scotland's going to start its economic journey from. This is a political decision that's been made because I believe the economics are too difficult. And this is a huge concern that's come out in the Fresh Start paper. So for me, and quote from the paper, Scotland can easily have a 10% public deficit. There's no problem with that. In fact, we need that. Coming after decades, centuries of lack of investment and spending in Scotland, we need a big public sector deficit. I would be going out to the population and saying, Westminster doesn't spend enough in Scotland. A new government has to spend more. The private sector is completely debt stressed. You need government money. We need to give people a job. We need to improve the infrastructure. We need to improve. This 10% is probably going to be more because it is what it is. If you want the private sector to save, and if we want, and we're in a position where we're still sending money abroad, and we've still got a trade deficit, we need at least a 10% public deficit with independence. But the Scottish Government are saying a 3% deficit. So what does that lead to? We're looking at the damage of austerity, and we know it. And I was going to quote the 300,000 people who premature deaths during austerity. But adopting this leads to this, and it leads to it in big red letters. It's much worse than the austerity we've got now. So let's assume we're independent, and we do in the paper, we just choose 2025 to make things easy. We're independent this year. we've got an 8% foreign sector surplus. And we move from a public sector balance of -10 to -3. Look at the difference in the private sector balance. It can only come from the private sector. So we're saving 2% of GDP right now. The government is saying to us, no, we want you to have less than 5% of GDP to allow us to get to 3%. It's just complete economic madness. So this is the decision that was made. So we thought, well, how did you get there? And this is where there's been no investigation, because we can prove that we're at 10% public deficit at the moment. And if we want to get to 3, we can prove that it has to come from the private sector. So we said it would collapse economic growth. It would raise unemployment. It would reduce public goods and services. It would likely also increase household debt stress, disproportionately affecting the lowest earners, women, children, and minority groups. All those groups are most impacted by austerity. So my conclusion, we need to start talking to the Scottish Government about a clean slate from institutions. And this idea, which is currently the plan, that they're going to grandfather institutions. And then the Fresh Start document says we'll grandfather all regulations from the UK government, and we'll start our independent nation like that. And then if we want to get rid of them or change any of them, we need an act of parliament to change them. So this puts you on what we call path dependency. This just puts us on a position where it will take a decade, 15, 20 years to move anywhere near away from this neoliberal establishment institutional setup that we've got. But my worry is also that we look to the European Union and we start altering our institutions to fit with the European Union. Now, that might be the end destination. It might be the best thing for us, and we see it in the paper. It might be the best thing, but it might be the worst thing. But what you've got to do is start with a clean slate, build all your institutions, and then after a decade say, right, where do we go now that we have full employment, that we have proper infrastructure, that we do have a care and health service, that we do have a better educational system? Now, where do we go? And that's not the plan that the Scottish Government are proposing. So I've given a little bit of detail. There's a lot of detail in the paper about what an alternative would be. So you don't have these fiscal rules. You say we're going to macro manage our economy on these 4 things: full employment, sustainable resource use, price stability, and economic stability. Not a 3% rule, but actually looking at how you balance the whole economy. And then finally, we note in the paper that having sterling for any period of time makes this worse. So start by saying there will be no period where Scotland as an independent nation will use the pound. On day 1, we will be using our own currency. In fact, 2 or 3 years before that, we will be issuing and using our own currency.
And if you'd like to know more about this topic, we've put the link to one of Scottonomics' articles in the notes to the podcast.
If you're independent and you don't have your own currency, then you're really limited about how you can free up that interdependency.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes interdependency is great, when there's a mutual help going on and support, that's great. But not if, at the moment, something like for every 100 quid that's produced or earned or in Scotland, 6 or 8, there's a bit of an argument about it, but 6 or 8 pounds is going abroad. 6 or 8 pounds, therefore, isn't around to help sustain infrastructure and jobs and everything.
And Commonweal's Robin McAlpine took this point of foreign direct investment even further in his session.
Up and down is net wealth import, net wealth export. The higher up you go, the more money is coming into your country on an annual basis. The further down you go, the more is being exported out of your country. Left to right, poorest per capita, richest per capita. So this is wealth, and this is wealth retention. That is, as you would imagine, the worst case, heavily indebted, poor countries. So they're obviously not generating a lot of GDP. They're exporting a lot of it because they're paying interest to the big companies. These are other combinations of poorer countries. These are the less developed countries. Now, if you work your way up, you get into the world average is about up here. Now we're tipping into the green. These are all wealth exporters. They're giving their money away to the rest of the world. The green is the wealth importers. These are the countries which are drawing wealth from the rest of the world into them. So these are basically all the Western economies. That's the Eurozone there. European Union is actually slightly ahead of the Eurozone. That's the US and North America, right? So that's where that is. Now, let me show you the depressing bit. Where's Scotland sitting at? That's Scotland there. Right, that's Scotland there. I should have said, by the way, this is Craig's work. I'm just stealing Craig's work. 5 countries are clustered round about here, and they are all tax havens. The reason that they would be clustered around there is those tax havens would naturally have been over about here. But what they do by being tax havens is they're deliberately leaky, but that accelerates their growth, right? So that's their strategy. So we're not a tax haven. Why are we here? Very straightforward. We are basically the most overseas owned economy we can find anywhere. Right, so we're gone. Name me a major Scottish company owned in Scotland.
Scottish Power.
Scottish Power is Spanish. SSE, Scottish and Southern Electricity, has 2 parts, one of which is part owned in Scotland. We've got 2 whisky companies, Grant, San, Erdingtons. And what? We don't have a bank, we don't have energy. We don't have housing. Craig's going to tell you about that, so I won't touch the housing. We don't own our supermarkets. What do we own? Yeah, but I mean, these are not major players. One brewing company. I mean, when we're talking about the whisky industry compared to Brewdog, I mean, it's the scale thing. Right. What I'm trying to tell you is, we're here discussing Scotland's currency post-independence. What does that tell you about Scotland's currency post-independence? If that was a balance of trade graph, you would instantly see, without categorically show it to 1,000 economists, and thousands of them will say you need to devalue your currency. Too much is going out, not enough's coming in, you're not competitive. Except look where we are. We're wealthier than the Eurozone. That's not a balance of trade. That's a balance of ownership. We don't own our own economy. What happens after independence if that became the case? Well, let me give you the most ludicrous possible scenario, that we do what the SNP's official policy is, which is sterlingisation. So we've got to go down, I mean, I'm being sarcastic, but I'm not. We've literally got to go down to London and fill up wheelbarrows full of sterling because we are not allowed to produce it. We don't have any sovereign currency. So we have to go down to Westminster, get wheelbarrows full of currency and bring it up. But every year, for every £100 of currency in our economy, we are losing £6. So we've got to replace those £6 to maintain liquidity in the economy. So we are having to borrow 6% of GDP just to stay solvent. That's the SNP's policy. Why am I telling you this? Because we are not serious. These are strategic thoughts because we are not presenting ourselves strategically as serious, because we're not asking the big questions and we're not engaging with them. Now, the Scottish Currency Group is, hats off, congratulations, the most valuable, most important piece of the independence movement at the moment is the Scottish Currency Group, because it's doing things of value. But the Scottish Currency Group is looking at currency, and there's an awful lot more than that we need to look at if we're being serious. So we've got no ownership. Why? Okay, so let me tell you the story which I think captures this in a nutshell. Gresham House. Who has winced? You people don't know who Gresham House... There we go, wincing up the back. They know who Gresham House is. Gresham House is a no-name London consultancy. It's registered in London, it's based in London, its office is in London, its staff is in London. About 3 years ago, the Scottish National Investment Bank gave it a £50 million loan using your money. Scottish taxpayer money was given as a £50 million loan to a London-based consultancy. Why? That London-based consultancy is a consultancy which advises wealthy investors on how to buy Scottish land and exploit the tree planting to milk Scottish subsidies overseas investors. Right? This no-name consultancy 3 years ago had no presence in Scotland. Gresham House is now Scotland's second biggest landowner. Every penny generated from that land and all the public subsidies are being exported. It's all being exported. Right, so I'm going to try and get to grips with this in ways that you can picture. In the first 20 years of devolution, we willingly gave up an entire year's wealth. We sent it out. About half of it went to England, elsewhere in the UK, and about half of it went to elsewhere in the world. And it's called foreign direct investment. And you think foreign direct investment is nice people coming here and building big factories to create new jobs. It's not. It's buying our assets and ripping the piss out of us. That's what foreign direct investment is. Foreign direct investment can be great when they come here and build factories, right? But they're not here building factories. They're here putting up wind turbines that they built in China and then piping all the wealth out. The Scottish Government is talking about funding a pipeline so that foreign-owned corporations can take Scottish hydrogen straight out of Scotland without touching our territorial land, only our water territory, straight out and straight to Germany. So that a private company in Germany and a private relationship based in Scotland's assets with no payoff for Scotland whatsoever. What kind of strategy is this? What sense does that make? This graph tells us two things at the same time. The first thing it tells us is that Scotland must get out of the UK as fast as it humanly can. That is a result of being regionalised. Scotland used to be a domestic economy. We had banks, we had big business, we had big exporters. We were a serious player. Right? That is us being regionalised. If we don't get out, we will be the West Midlands. In fact, West Midlands probably owns more of its own economy than we do, would be my guess. Bet you they've got a couple of big players. We are being regionalised, and if we don't get out, that is going to get worse and worse. But it tells us another thing. It tells us that we're not ready, because what is our strategy for dealing with this? We must nationalise and take into public ownership our energy. We can't export our energy wealth. We've got to retain that wealth. If we don't retain that wealth, we're off our heads. We've got to stop letting foreign corporations develop all of our property. It's extracting all of the wealth. I would go further. I would be opening a debate right now. I would pass a law in this country that nobody can own more than 3 whisky distilleries. Seriously, 3 whisky distilleries. Whatever, pick a number. They're a craft distillery which is fundamental to the culture, history of this country, and they're virtually entirely owned by the Japanese, the Americans, the French, and the English. Almost completely owned by them. We've got 2 major whisky companies that aren't, and the rest of it's all foreign owned. So I would be using the Scottish National Investment Bank to fund management buyouts right across the whisky industry. Repatriate those businesses back into Scotland. But you see, then when you say that, you realise that the point of the big whisky companies isn't so much making whisky. Whisky distilleries in this country are primarily making cheap vodka, which then goes into is sold onto the gin industry. Whisky is just a loss leader. They run whisky as a loss leader on the top, even though it's phenomenally profitable. But that's not what you're really buying with these companies. You're really buying distribution systems. Interbev, these companies, they're distributing whisky. So if we're going to do that, we need to build a national whisky export industry agency. We need to cooperatise the export and the market access of the whisky industry. We need to diversify it anyway. The US has always been an unreliable partner. It's now a reliably bad partner. And I'm no fan of the Chinese Communist Party. But you know where you are with China. Where are you with America? These are big, big, massive questions. The main strategic thing I want to get across here is the next 9 months is just a dead zone. This is not an independence election. It's got nothing to do with independence. The campaign's got nothing to do with independence. The SNP's been struggling to maximise turnout of its core vote. It's using a core vote strategy of saying the word independence as many times as possible to try and get the maximum number of its core vote out to give it the largest possible grouping in the parliament. It will not achieve a majority. Sitting in the 35%, it hasn't moved. It's 2 years since the SNP moved the polls in an upwards direction. So that's not what's happening. We just need to sit out these 9 months. When they're out the way, probably about June next year, you'll suddenly realise that first of all, we don't have a parliamentary majority, and second of all, we've now ruled out the parliament as a route for action. Thank God, we should have been doing that a long time ago. You've heard me say this many, many times. I'm not anti-politics. God, I spent my life on it. But it doesn't mean that politics does everything all the time. This next phase is not going to happen in Parliament. No one can actually come up with a piece of legislation that progresses things in the Parliament. So I'm not looking at that just now. I'm looking at the big questions. The simple truth is, and I've been saying this for a decade now, we're failing to make progress on the debate on independence because people don't think we're taking ourselves seriously. And we're not. We're not. We're still lobbing leaflets with pictures of wind turbines through the door and doing jazz hands. Right? The public wasn't saying, send us more pictures of wind turbines. The public were saying, we've got various questions that we would like to believe that you've answered and you haven't answered them. How should I have confidence in you? I could talk you over it. I did it last year at this conference. I talked you through the research which demonstrated precisely why people aren't coming over to independence even though they want to believe. The next 10% of people that we need to win to get to 60%, they want to believe that Scotland could be an independent country, but they need us to demonstrate it. They're not hostile to Scottish independence. They're not hostile at all. They just don't think we know what we're doing. We are about to go into a crash and a reality check. Even if the SNP got a majority at the next election, it's going to be the demise. That same week is going to be the week that the Labour Party defenestrates Starmer. The only constant in British politics at the moment is that Labour can always get worse. That's the only. I look at it with amazement, and I'm thinking, my God, you've lost all your core vote, and you've decided to pick a fight over small boats again. Right? Every time you do this, you lose more votes. But here's the thing that should alarm us. I was reading the National yesterday, and I was flipping just through the headlines. There was a headline that says SNP poll lead increases. And I remember thinking to myself, well, I don't personally think it's because of anything the Scottish Government's done, but for me as a political strategist, it would be almost impossible for them not to be increasing their lead, right? I mean, when your primary opposition's in free fall, you should... And I clicked the link, read the article, and they hadn't moved us a bit. The lead had increased because Labour had fallen. To my amazement, they're still in 35%. And they have been for 18 months, and they haven't moved. They actually came down to 21% in the list, which made me go, what? Right? So we're not even absorbing the disillusionment. We're not even converting people. We are not working effectively. We are stuck in a devolutionary cycle. We're addressing our problems with a devolutionary mindset. What I'm arguing is, when this crash comes soon, this time next year we will be in it. It is our time to finally get our heads together and reset. This stuff is not unfixable. We need a national industrial policy to recapture ownership of the Scottish economy in Scotland. Commonwealth's got lots of work on this, and we're about to start out on some more, because this is the most important factor facing our economy just now.
Robin there was saying there's 10% of people who would take us from 50 to 60% for independent support. They want to be convinced, they need more information. And something that says, well, look, here's the big picture. Here's all the things. You know, rather than just picking on one little thing, what currency are you going to use? What about looking at the whole economic, social values, or, you know, the entire structure and infrastructure of the country, or the country we would like it to be, how those things all link up? And I think if I was in that 10% of wanting to be convinced, the fact that I knew somebody had identified it and was looking at it would probably be enough for me at that point. That would make me feel more reassured.
I just think Robin was a bit pessimistic.
He can be
a bit pessimistic over
negative.
that.
Whereas the idea that nobody is looking at it, we've got another 9 wasted months while they fight an election that may have no bearing on anything.
And Scottish Socialist Party leader Colin Fox gave a really, really good speech at the conference as well. We've got the tail end of it.
We've got to win the next referendum that we have, and I'm not in favour of having one unless we win it. And I know you don't get that guarantee, but I'm not having referendum for the sake of having referendum. We have to win it. I look to see what happened in Canada and Quebec. They lost twice and it's now over. Alberta's the state now pressing for its independence in Canada, no Quebec anymore. So, but let's assume we get our independence. A newly independent Scotland the circumstances that we inherit will obviously be dictated by the mandate we won in fighting for it. So what we say we're going to do when we win determines what we do. It's really important at that point, because there are people who say to me, oh, but Colin, look, you need to leave all that redistribution of wealth. You need to leave Scotland being a republic till after we get independence, and then we'll do it then. And I say with all due respect, I know your point of view, I've heard it many a time, with all due sincerity, you're both naive and wrong. Because unless you spell out what independence is for and what you're going to do, you're never going to win the vote. You need to be specific. People demand attention to detail. They want the I's dotted and they want the T's crossed. And you have to explain what you're going to do. And you also have to have done that before you have any workable mandate for what you then want to do. And I think we've seen from the Brexit referendum, the tortuous process after 2016, that took, almost 5, 6, 7 years. There'll be a long, protracted process after Scotland has voted for its independence, negotiating about assets and liabilities, timescales, responsibilities, international relationships, trade relationships, etc. That will take many years. And you have to have a cast iron mandate, cast iron vision of precisely what you want to do, who you want to be representing you in those negotiations, and their conviction that, for example, Trident is non-negotiable. We won't say to you that, yes, we will keep Trident for 10 years, and if you just give us a bung, that'll be fine. It's a principle that says we refuse in an independent Scotland to threaten the rest of the world with annihilation. We won't do it. And today we need a plan for that future. This conference is part about laying down a plan today, 2025. You know, the referendum and the processes are coming down the line. We need to plan today about the kind of plan that we want and the kind of Scotland that we see, the investment in the country, the kind of country we want to build and how we present it. And independent Scotland, for me, represents profound change. Our message is independence is about profound change. It's not about tinkering on the edges of the status quo. It's about constructing a brand new world, a brand new country in many senses, and a nation that refuses to be part of a 300-year-old union where one large nation effectively rules the smaller one. Their days are over. We're having our own rights. We're having our own say-so. And it's a revolution in a sense, a revolution in terms of who runs Scotland and how it's governed and by which guiding principles and which values. And to be specific, the independence movement, again, will make sure this weekend that democracy for us is sacrosanct. This is about the will of the people. You know, the powerful elite in the country, Scotland, they exist, they will have their say, but their say will be behind the will of the majority of the population laid down in the manifesto that say. And for me and for the Scottish Socialist Party, independence as its centre means a substantial and irreversible redistribution of Scotland's wealth in favour of those who need it the most. That's got to be the centrepiece. And it's the centrepiece, in my view and in my experience, of the independence case. That's one of its strongest attractions. An end to the warmongering of Trident, an end to the imperialist ideology that's dominated Scotland for centuries and sent our sons round the world to die in wars for the British and latterly Western European empires. Economically, we want to see a growth strategy to maximise the wealth and creation and the potential wealth in the country, to build the hospitals, schools, technological infrastructure demanded in the 21st century. And that's a job for us all. We tap into the potential of every Scot, and everybody who's here wants to contribute to that future is part of your future. You're sharing it as an equal part of it. And that's the kind of independent Scotland and independent vision the Scottish Socialist Party have.
And then we enticed him into the press room at the conference, which we'd set up as a little studio, and asked him a bit more.
There's going to be a certain sitting down and delving into the detail. You know, Jim Sellers that I meet all the time, he's going, independence won't be achieved the day we win the vote. So how are we going to negotiate with the other side, who we know are a bunch of rogues, who are going to try and stop us getting what we want? And we've got to work out what's negotiable and what's not negotiable, and who we're going to have, and what expertise do we have. And I suppose what he's tending towards is, where are the people, the experts we're going to need to run the country? We have to know them now. They're not just going to show up on the day. In fact, the ones that show up the day after we win it are the ones you don't want to go near, like a bar pole. It's a bit opportunist apart from anything else. So I think this is a really important time for maturity, for expertise, for trust being building, and the elections, by their nature, they're divisive, aren't they? The Scottish Socialist Party will be standing, the SNP will be standing, the Greens will be standing, Alba will be standing, and that tends to throw up the differences. Each party's trying to, it's a bit like peacocks, we're more deserving your vote than another, right? And I'm not sure the independence issue is going to dominate that election next year. The dominant issue is going to be Labour. People are absolutely scunnered by Labour. And even Caerphilly yesterday. What you've got is reform and stop reform. That's all that happened there. I mean, the vote for Labour 11%, the Tories 2%, the Greens 1%, the Liberals 1%. It was reform and stop reform. That might be a better indicator of the nature of the election in Scotland next year. To be honest with you, I don't know too much about Plaid Cymru. I mean, I seen the vote, I seen that guy that won has stood 15 times. Yeah. I feel like it's kin, I've stood 15 times myself. I feel empathy with the guy, right? I don't know too much about what they're doing. I don't know about the, political platform Plaid. I suspect Plaid are probably getting the benefit of people who, they're scunnered with Labour, and they're terrified of reform, so the conduit, the receptacle for those votes are Plaid in Wales. And in some way, that's the same with the SNP in Scotland. I think the SNP support is artificially high because people are saying the only way we can stop reform is by voting for the SNP. That's not the same as a vote for the SNP. It's certainly not the same as a vote for independence. And it's people overlooking the fact that actually the SNP are pretty stale. They've been in power for 17, 18, 19 years now. Very little fresh about them. Transformation won't be coming with John Swinney's name in there. But in a way, that's what's more remarkable. They're at 33%.
Exactly.
This is the party that's been in power for 19 years at 33% now. So I don't think it's an endorsement of their record. It'd be the wrong thing to draw the conclusion that it's a great endorsement of them. It's almost like your insurance policy against Farage. And then we'll come to that, what happens after the election's more important. And that's got a bearing in independence debate. If Farage does really well in Scotland, it might galvanise people saying, that's what's coming to Westminster. Yeah. They're going to win a UK election, right? That could act as an accelerant. The socialists talk about the whiff of counter-revolution tends to focus the mind, don't they? So the whiff of reform focuses people's minds. So how do you actually stop it once and for all? I mean, I wouldn't want to sit here and pretend I'm Nostradamus. I think Labour's decline has even surprised me. I mean, Starmer's the most poorly supported Prime Minister there's ever been and all that. I mean, Labour's support is just terrible, and it's like way beyond the opinion polls. I mean, we're going leafleting tomorrow in the south side of Edinburgh. We're leaflet every Sunday now in the run-up to the election. The big working class schemes, we were next to Saughton Prison last week and the rest of it, right? And Labour, you couldn't buy a vote for Labour in these places, including tomorrow we're in Ian Murray's constituency. So, the guy that thinks he's Mr. Teflon, can't touch him, right? Labour, they've not got a friend. The trouble is, they're thinking of voting reform. Saughton and Drylaw and Pilton and the Inch where I stay and tomorrow we're in Fernieside. That's no difficult to fathom because it's an anti-Labour sentiment in itself. I think it's very easy to predict that Labour their support would turn to ashes because if you sell yourself as Starmer did on the basis that he's not the Tories, that's not enough.
Especially if you then act like the Tories.
Yeah, then kick the stool under you. He does all the things the Tories would have done anyway. Yeah. And, this time last year, I think we were talking, the speculation is whether Rachel Reeves will last the year. Yeah. Well, she's lasted a year, but there's problems haven't gone away, so that's the focus of politics. We would prefer it to be on independence and the currency and, when we take over and things like that, and what independence would mean. Well, that means that those conversations still take place, and they take place in a more considered environment. If you think of what happened before 2014, you had all these different groups. Before 2012, so I realise I'm taking you back 2 years even before that, but in 2012, lots of different groups doing their own thing. And it took Yes Scotland to pull it together. So it's the strings in your bag pulled it all together to one, because there was a referendum. There was a 18 months, 2 years. There was an end, the race began and there was the finishing line, right? Before 2012, the Scottish Socialist Party, the Greens, they still had the Scottish Independence Convention, but to be honest, it was mince. Nobody went to the meetings, they existed, they weren't doing very much, nobody took it seriously. Above all, the SNP didn't take it seriously. And then, of course, when the independence referendum was called, the Independence Convention wasn't the forum they decided to build it around. They started again, right? So there were as many different organisations back then, right? But my feeling is I'm quite sanguine about it. These conferences and groups doing their own thing, as you say, there's a place for it. And, I keep an eye, you keep an eye. There's sufficient of us to oil it all together. So when it comes to it, then we need to pull things together to a much more focused and organised and attentive to, we've got a referendum to win and a case to win. That happens organically because the things that are seen as ephemeral lose their, they lose the intensity, and what becomes as intense as the vote itself. The thing about the Hamilton by-election that we talked about, right? That was extremely rare. There hadn't been a Scottish Parliament by-election for donkey's years. What then happens after next June or next May? Then you're into the territory of by-elections for the Scottish Parliament because the margins are going to be so close there. They then could be the determinant issue of who wins by-elections may well be the independence issue. If you've got the wet, the warm breath of reform, they're going to have 12 of them in the Parliament. God knows where they're going down south, etc., that prospect and everything, So my feeling is I don't look for any great change to the circumstance next May. I don't think much is going to change. It's after that you see the changes taking place. And then you've got the questions of the economy and society and what's happening. There's a great deal of anger out there. People are angry at Labour and they're going to reform. Busted flush. Then where did they take their anger?
Well, we're getting a bit, even though I am a bit wabbit, we are kind of getting a bit engaged with it.
Yes, we are engaged with it. And I think the trick is going to be, as with all of these things, you leave having had a really good, stimulating, thought-provoking day, and then you want to see what's going to happen afterwards. What's the next step? And to me, that's the bit that's still a bit vague, is, yes, I see that we need to start having these conversations. I'm not sure I see what the vehicle is that's going to make that happen. Now, it might be the Independence Congress. It might be this new Yes Unite. It might be
Scottish Forum for Independence. There's also the Scottish Independence Convention.
Yeah.
I mean, so that's what I've been thinking all the way through this, is that maybe, we need to reach a point where, say with currency, the arguments have been made to us and we're convinced. I don't just mean you and me, but but then expand that out into the independence movement, then expand it out to the rest of the population. Do we need to carry on having dedicated smaller conferences about those sort of single issues? But how do we then? Well, maybe we do, but then how do we kind of bring them all together into a coherent plan for an independent Scotland? And maybe it will be this Indie Congress that, believe in Scotland, the SNP at least at the moment are part and parcel of, and that'll need to expand. It can't just be those two.
It needs to be a bigger conversation, a wider conversation. It needs to have the politics in. But I mean, the way Gordon described the Congress, that could be the vehicle, bringing in some of these specialist, almost niche areas of expertise. Yeah. Energy is another topic that there's a massive amount.
And there's a Scottish Energy Group, and it would be good to hear more from them, actually. So anyway, it's a work in progress, as is Scotland.
As always, we are here trying to make sense of it as it happens, and perhaps it'll be a bit more coherent by the time we've reflected.
Which was probably obvious in this rather ad hoc sit down, have a chat, actually, but yeah.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can click the little bell and you get a reminder whenever we put out a new episode, which is every Friday.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website. And we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.
And we'll catch you later. Bye now.